Hey guys, thanks for joining me. Did you know, real quick, that every single side-scrolling beat-em-up that we have right now in the arcades can all be attributed? Games like Contra or Alien vs. Predator or RoboCop or games like that, even Super Mario Brothers, can all be attributed to shmups, shoot-em-ups? Watch and find out. Shmups are such a fascination to me. See, back in the day when arcades were just introduced to the public and they had absolutely no idea what they were in for, shmups were the quintessential arcade game. The likes of Space War from 1962 or even Sega's Periscope in 1965 are perhaps the grandfathers of them all. But who's the daddy? We asked that question. Who's your daddy? Who's the daddy? The arcade hit Space Invaders in 1978 was a mainstay, and the likes of Asteroids and Galaxian further solidified this genre in the psyche of arcade enthusiasts. What made this genre so intoxicating to so many of us, though, was that it was primarily based on reaction time. Even playing Asteroids at my Atari arcade now shows that if you're slow, you're dead. But in 1978, things were different. You guys remember that game? It was so powerful. It was the game called Space Invaders. It was such an amazing game, put out by Taito. Put out by a gentleman by the name of Tomohiro Nishikado. He was the creator of Space Invaders that was so powerful. It was such an electric game. It electrified the psyche of everybody involved. And it took elements from the hit Breakout from 1976 and it kind of expanded on that. And it just made everything so beautiful. And it really kind of opened up this genre of shmups. Technology was low at the time, obviously, because the arcade genre was so new. So they set the game in space because they couldn't render the movement of aircraft like that of Galaga later on. When everyone was obsessed with bell-bottoms and disco, Space Invaders took the imagination of each player and introduced the concept of enemies firing back at the player, introducing multiple lives for the game, and subsequently popularized the concept of high scores. This was seminal in its approach and changed the entire landscape of arcade creation. So in 1979, when everybody was going goo goo and gaga over movies like Sinbad, The Adventures of Sinbad, epic movie, and Kramer vs. Kramer, no one had any idea they were sitting on a gold mine of arcades. And this new arcade comes out after Space Invaders, an arcade by the name of Galaxian. This game, more than any other game, ushered in the golden age of arcade games, one in which are dripping with nostalgia for most of us watching this video. I wonder where we would be without these games, you know, they're like our favorite stuffed animals at night, snuggling with them and holding them tight. Where did that time go? Other games like Xevious, Asteroids, and Gorf should be mentioned here as they built upon the framework of Space Invaders, introducing multi-directional play. And all of these arcade manufacturers and creators built and stood upon the shoulders of those who went before them. Then, as they continued to build the structure of these shmups, they developed something called side-scrolling shmups, side-scrolling shoot-em-ups, right, in the early 80s, the greatest decade known to man. I may be a little biased, I think a lot of us are a little biased when it comes to this, but one game stands out in the early 80s as one of the best side-scrolling shoot-em-ups ever, and that's the game Defender. Put up by Williams Electronics allowed this game to have side-scrolling in both directions, and man was this an absolute hit. It pioneered so much because it allowed side-scrolling in both directions and featured a minimap radar. Then this game named Scramble comes out in early 1981 and had a continuous scrolling in one direction with multiple different levels. This would soon pave the way for a classic game of R-Type and the like. Okay, so at this point it's really important to note, in the early 80s, Japanese developers really kind of moved away from these shmups and really started to develop these games that were character-based and were kind of like action shoot-em-ups, so to speak. But the American developers really focused just solely on these shoot-em-ups for the next really golden age. Up until the early 90s, they were focused on this. And you can see this continued influence over these games with the likes of Robotron 2084, which is one of my all-time favorites. And I know many of us in the arcade 1-up scene can't wait for them to come out with Robotron 2084 and hopefully Smash TV. All of those are influenced by these shmups. All of them are standing on the shoulders of these guys who developed these amazing games. So with each passing year, technology would grow. Some games began to experiment with things like 3D perspective. We see this in Atari's amazing hit Tempest, one of my favorites, as one of the earliest tube shooters that later went on to influence other rail shooters. Then in 1981, Zaxxon, a hugely underrated game, introduced isometric video game graphics to the genre. And from this, run and gun games became all the rage, which we'll get to those in just a second. So we get to 1985. Thank God. One of the best years ever, not only for movies, but for arcades as well. And thank God disco has died. Let me just put it that way. Look at this. This is, I mean, can you please tell me what's going on here? I mean, did they really wear that stuff? Anyways, I digress. This game Gradius comes out. Man, put out by Konami, giving the player greater control over a choice of weaponry and introduced another element of strategy. Gradius really was the game that defined side-scrolling shoot-em-ups, and later Sega's Fantasy Zone emerged, giving Sega its first mascot in Opa Opa. This paved the way for another subgenre of games entitled shoot-em-ups, but we won't go there in this video. Gradius and even Fantasy Zone were seminal. They were huge in their development, in the development of these games. Like I said, you can see the progression of these games from Space Wars all the way now to Fantasy Zone or Gradius in 1985. So now we come to some more detailed graphics in the background with the onset of greater technology and processing power. So it made games like Sega's Ninja Princess, which you see here, hugely popular, as well as Capcom's Commando in 1985. There were so many games vying for the coveted quarters of preteens and teenagers. The game that can be traced from all of these is the ever-popular Ikari Warriors put out by SNK. It created unique rotary controls and drew inspiration from even more popular movie Rambo First Blood Part 2. I didn't know that, but Ikari Warriors was originally intended to be an adaptation of that movie. So run and gun games became the dominant style of shoot-em-ups during the late 1980s and early 1990s. The term shoot-em-ups became synonymous with run and gun during this time too. Okay, so we get to some really crazy games. Post 1985, you see that these games are starting to stand on the shoulders of some of these Japanese creators, where they created the characters based around these movies sometimes, or based around their own creations. And they developed games like Rolling Thunder, Namco's Rolling Thunder, or they developed games like Data East's RoboCop. Some incredible games that we absolutely love, that we don't necessarily associate with shmups. But obviously you can see the progression kind of move along. And guess what? One of our favorite games, or at least one of my favorite games, the game of Contra, can also be attributed to this. Believe it or not, Contra still has roots in Space Wars. It has roots in Space Invaders. It has roots in these Galaxian games that came before it. Because of the processing power, they're able to move and manipulate these characters and get these detailed backgrounds that are so beautiful. So after 1985, with the development of home console games like the NES and Sega Genesis system a little bit later, creators for gun and run and gun games did whatever they could to stand out. Not many did, because they were vying for that all-important quarter for the teens and preteens, right? So with the home consoles, they didn't have to, but they still needed to sell their games, and not many of them stood out, maybe with the exception of Sega Genesis Gunstar Hero, because Sega Genesis does what Nintendo had to say. So two games then emerged here that are worth noting, and I mentioned one before. R-Type was released in 1987 by Outrun and employed a much slower pace in side-scrolling, but had these insane levels that made you feel kind of claustrophobic amidst needing incredible strategy. And then also, finally in 1990, another game that I think most of you guys love, named Raiden, emerged as the defining side-scrolling game that spawned a ton of games afterwards. But ultimately, all of these could be traced back to Space Wars, the hitting the zeitgeist of culture in Space Invaders. Pretty interesting, I think. I sure hope you've enjoyed this little jaunt down memory lane and kind of see the progression of shmups and how influential they were for basically all of the arcades. I mean, really, Space Invaders was that important. And even Space Wars was kind of the beginning, but really you kind of progressed Space Invaders and everybody kind of borrows from that. If you've enjoyed it, please don't forget to like this video and also subscribe. It helps the channel out as I'm going to start to put some more content out like I used to. And if you've been along the ride and I haven't put anything out for so long, I apologize. Hopefully I'll get some more stuff out. the game that I always go to now, my favorite shmup of all time is going to be Galaga, with Gigawing being close second now that I have it on my name. So anyways, I hope you guys are enjoying that. Keep outrunning that neon sun. God bless, and I'll see you guys next time.